Hey guys, we are done with chapter 9 and moving into chapter 10, the last chapter of the year. Not the last bit of learning we're going to be doing for the year, but the last chapter for the last unit. So just be aware that even though we're finishing up the unit 8 next week, we are not actually done with learning until after Memorial Day. So, having said that, let's get to it. Chapter 9, and its focus on the virtue of chastity, which in itself is uh, a offshoot, if you will, of the cardinal virtue of temperance. But also, in many ways, it was related to the cardinal virtue of justice, giving what we owe to others, particularly what we owe in terms of the gift of sexuality that we've been given. Um, in chapter 10, the focus moves almost exclusively to justice and what is owed to neighbor. And we will then be focusing on the 7th, 8th, and 10th commandments as a result. So, pushing to the front is the cardinal and moral virtue of justice, right? Um, the 7th and 10th commandments really ask us to respect and not covet the goods of others, i.e., don't steal, don't want to steal what belongs to others. And the 8th commandment is to not bear false witness against your neighbor. Uh, Put another way, it's asking us to give what we owe others, which is the truth. So when we look at justice, justice is the virtue through which we give God and neighbor what is their due by right. When it comes to God, we are always going to be in a deficit. We'll never be able to give what we owe Him, right? Because God made everything, including us. And He did it out of love, and He keeps everything in existence, right? So it's only just for us to acknowledge God's goodness. And when we do that, we are practicing the virtue of religion, which itself is related to justice. Um, and we also practice justice when we love neighbor, right? So loving God and worshiping Him above everything is as just as we can be with Him. And to our neighbor, justice is how we dispose ourselves to respect the rights of every person that we encounter and what we're called to work towards in the relationships, the human relationships that we establish with others. Doing so promotes equity, harmony, and works toward the common good. Okay? So when we talk about justice, we are going to talk about different types of justice. We're going to talk about commutative justice, commutative, right? We're going to talk about distributive justice. We're going to talk about legal justice, and we're going to talk about social justice. In fact, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about social justice, focusing in on it, because the church has an entire doctrine which is called, strangely enough, social justice or social justice teaching doctrine, in which we are called to really kind of, at its core, is reflective in how we are called to love neighbor and show that love to neighbor. So let's enter into it. You're responsible for this for pages 238 to 245 in your textbooks, which if you clicked on this, you'll see in the table itself. And hopefully by the time we're done, you're going to recognize a couple of things. First and foremost, that honesty and justice are pivotal virtues that we need to cultivate and develop to be who God created us to be. Second, hopefully that you're going to be able to identify justice as a cardinal and moral virtue that was given to us by God to render to Him and to neighbor what we owe them. And third, hopefully by the time this video is over, you're going to be able to distinguish between and amongst, though amongst is actually the correct word there, amongst the four different types of justice that I'm going to talk about today. Again, commutative, distributive, legal, and social. Okay. So let's start with the definition of justice, right? The Catechism of the Church, the CCC, right? The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines justice in the following way. It is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give each their due to God, to give their due, that is the person, me, you, their due to God and neighbor. Justice toward God is called the virtue of religion. Justice toward men disposes one to respect the rights of each and to establish in human relationships the harmony that promotes equity with regard to persons and to the common good. And so when we look at justice, right, justice really speaks to how we approach any relationship, right? Am I giving to that person what I owe them? And what do you owe the people that you meet? Love, respect, recognition of their human dignity, that they are a child of God, all those things that go with it. And so how then do we carry it out? And that leads us to the four different types of justice that we're going to talk about. And they each kind of speak to how we are giving to others what is owed to them. Okay? So commutative justice really talks about, I think, what most people think of when they think of justice and kind of the exchange of goods and exchange of stuff. I give $5 worth of effort in terms of building something, and the person that I built that something for gives me $5 for my effort, right? So justice is giving what you owe. When we move into the realm of charity, we are going beyond, right? Beyond what we owe that person. So charity is giving more than you owe another person. So I did use love in kind of the definition. And really, our Christian calling is to go beyond what we owe to others. In terms of justice, all we owe, right, is that kind of equity in terms of relationship, but we always can go above and beyond. Okay. So commutative justice, you'll find the definition for it on page number 241. Your textbook reads the following when it comes to commutative justice. It regulates relationships of exchange. It calls for fairness in agreements and contracts between individuals and various social groups. This type of justice requires the respect the equal human dignity of everyone involved in our exchanges, right? So as human beings, we have exchanges all the time, right? So it means fairness, it means justice in terms of the words we use, in terms of the actions we take, et cetera, et cetera. Commutative justice is really concerned with individual to individual relationship, person to person relationship. We then move into distributive justice. And in distributive justice, we're really talking about a different type of relationship. If commutative is between people, right? And when we say people, it can be groups of people and the individual, but people, right? When we talk about distributive justice, we're talking about those higher levels of society, those authorities in society. What do authorities owe to us as individuals? So when we're talking about distributive justice, we're talking about the reality that authorities, and this is going back to what we talked about in the fourth commandment, when we're talking about authorities, they have to make sure that they're looking out for us, that they're protecting us, that they're promoting the common good and the public welfare. Distributive justice is going to seek justice, fairness in distribution of the goods of creation. Now, when I talk about the goods of creation, that could seem like a really kind of widespread concept, but it's really talking about those necessities of life. When we talk about stuff, yes, we as Catholics believe that we have the right to private property, but there are some things that we do not have the right to private ownership of in light of the common good. So, for example, if we live in an area, right, where there's not a lot of access to clean water, distributive justice demands that an authority make sure that all have access to clean water. Okay, and that's distribution of the goods of creation, stuff that's good for all to have, um, food, water, etc. Those are things that we're really talking about as far as distributive justice. That concept is called the universal destination of goods. And it teaches us that God gave us the earth. And as human beings, God gave it to us. We are stewards. We are not the kings. We don't have dominion of the earth, right? God granted us stewardship. So we're taking care of it, right? But we don't own it. And so since we're taking care of it, there are certain things that we can't claim ownership of. And that really boils down to we have the right to enjoy the fruits of God's creation, right? And it's the function of the authorities in terms of distributive justice to make sure that people have access to those fruits of creation. So we have commutative, person to person. We have distributive, which is those legal authorities like governments, etc., what they owed us as individuals. And now there's a reverse relationship. What do we as individuals owe to those authorities? And that's what's known as legal justice. Okay. In terms of legal justice, we as people do have the right to private property, right? And as such, we have the right to own it. But when it comes to legal justice, this kind of speaks to what we as citizens owe to the government. And you kind of get the idea just from the name of it, legal justice. We have to obey laws, right? Excuse me. We have to obey just laws. So as social beings, we need to do things that are going to work toward the common good of others. We got to do things like vote. We got to do things like live amongst other people. So when we talk about legal justice, we have to do our part to build up the communities that we live in. We have to obey the just laws of our government. We have to pay taxes. We have to serve on juries. We have to do those things that we consider that, well, maybe not we do, but the universe as a whole considers the qualities of a good citizen, right? So when we look at legal justice, we're really talking about good citizenship. Again, this one ties into that fourth commandment. Even though we're talking about the 7th, 8th, and 10th commandments, it does kind of pivot back into that idea of authority and how we're called to respond to it. Okay. Again, it starts in the fourth commandment and works out its way out into all the other ones. Just kind of underscoring this relationship amongst the 10 commandments, how they're all related to each other. When we break one, we really break all of them. In addition to that, legal justice also asks that we come to the assistance of our fellow citizens if they get in trouble. This is all part and parcel of what we are called to do as good citizens. Okay, so the fourth and final block, if you will, of the four types of justices is social justice. Social justice is really the application of Christ's message into the structures and systems of societies, right? To make sure that we're protecting the dignity of the people around us, recognizing their humanness. We're looking out for the least in our midst. It's the application of the corporal works of mercy around us, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, etc., etc. And it really speaks to how we're called to look out for the people around us. So that's the broad view. Now I'm going to kind of narrow view and give you some more specifics when it comes to social justice. This used to be a course that I taught, and it used to take an entire, 6 months, an entire 5 months or so of a semester, an entire semester, 2 quarters to go through all of it. So the fact that I'm going to try and condense it down into 5 minutes, bear with me if I give you a lot of information. social justice is also what's known as contributive justice. So there's two names for social justice and contributive justice, because it really is the way through which we're able to contribute to society and contribute to the justice of the world around us. So speaking of social justice or contributive justice, there are four main points that your textbook brings up. And when we talk about social justice, they're all pretty important. First and foremost, and this seems kind of antithetical, I guess, to some of our kind of modalities and mindsets, particularly here in the United States, where we are very much kind of a capitalist kind of paradigm in terms of how we live and look out for how can I make a profit. Social justice says profit is okay, but it's not the main thing, right? Profit cannot be the only norm and sole goal of economic activity. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it becomes an obstacle to making sure that the people around you are taken care of, that the people around you have the food they need to eat, clothes on their backs, etc., it is an obstacle. And so that is one of the kind of key understandings or key values of the fourth type of justice. We need to make sure that we are looking out for those in need, right? And so capitalism in of itself is not necessarily evil, but if we don't pay attention to the least in our midst, it will and can be. Okay, and we have a responsibility to look after and look for real human need. Okay, the second of your four kind of main ideas, main doctrines of social justice, is this, and it ties into the first one. It's about economics and the economy. And again, I think we fail to recognize this for many people. And, we see this at the beginning of the year when I ask you guys, what do you want to be in the future? What do you see in the future for you? And most of you say, I want to be successful. And I ask you what successful means. And it becomes, I want to have a lot of money. And I kind of say, well, why is that important? There's a reason for that, right? And it's this understanding. The economy exists to serve people. Right? People do not exist to serve the economy. The economy is there to make sure that we have access to that which we need, right? So that we can focus in on what's most important, and that is relationships, right? Relationship with God, neighbor, and self. And so human work is a good thing. I'm never going to denigrate it. All of us are called in different ways to express ourselves through the work that we do, right? And we can and should be paid for the work that we do, right? It's how we share in the gifts that God has given us in His creative activity when we apply those God-given talents that He's given us. And every person does have the right to contribute to the economy as best they're able through the gifts that God has given, the talents that He's given them. But, and this is the but here, right? When it comes to social justice, right, we have the right to jobs, period, right? We have the right to just wages for the work that we do. We have the right to strike peacefully as a last resort to achieve economic justice. When the businesses that we work for, and this is what we're talking about as far as the workers, right? Much like we said, governments are there to work for the people. Tying into that, businesses and economies are there to work for the individuals, for the people that are doing the work, right? And so when we look at the social justice aspect of this, it's really pointing to that reality that those larger things, those entities, those corporations, economies that corporations are part of, etc., all those things exist for the individual, right? To make sure the individual is able to live out their life as the child of God they were created to be. Okay? The third point of social justice teaching: richer nations must work for solidarity. First and foremost, what is solidarity? Solidarity is a recognition in the brotherhood of man, i.e., every person you encounter is a brother or sister through Christ. Okay? And so when it comes to solidarity, it recognizes that some countries have more than others. And those countries that have more, well, they should share with those that have less, right? And there are some, and again, this is one of those things where I need to kind of draw the difference between equity and equality, that there are some countries that just don't have equal footing. And we are called to try to do the best we can to raise them up so they can be successful on their own, okay? To give them the tools that they need to be successful. It doesn't necessarily mean continue to give them money, throw money at them, etc. It means give them the capabilities, help them be capable to grow on their own. And that does involve money at times, but it involves education, it involves time, it involves effort and work, right, in those countries, modeling for them, etc. And that is one of the bases, if you will, of social justice doctrine as well. The fourth one that we're going to talk about is that we must imitate Jesus by having a special love for the poor. Again, I told you when I was talking about social justice teaching, right, it is really rooted in the corporal works of mercy. And particularly, Christ calls for us to show a love, special love for those most in need. In fact, he teaches us when you see one of the least in your midst, you see him. You see, well, he says, you see me, right? And what you do for the least, you do for me. And that's good and bad. When we do good stuff, that's good. When we do bad stuff, it's bad. Because we're not doing it necessarily to that person, although we are. We're also doing it to Jesus, because that person, even though we might see a dirty, disgusting bum or whatever you want to kind of say, that's Christ. And we're called to love them and treat them with the respect and dignity that they as a child of God have. Okay? All right, one other thing I quickly want to talk about, and this can sometimes be confusing. When we talk about solidarity, we have to talk about kind of the related thing, and we talked about this in the fourth commandment. I just want to make sure that you're kind of clear on the two concepts. We have solidarity, right? And solidarity is the reality that every person we encounter is a brother or sister. It's the recognition of the familial relationship that we all possess with every person we encounter. And then there's subsidiarity, which also is about justice, and it is part of the social doctrine, but we talked about it when we talked about the fourth commandment. Subsidiarity, again, is that idea that higher levels of governmental authority shouldn't interfere whenever a lower level can take care of it. The only proper time for a higher level of authority, governmental authority, to interfere at a lower one is when the lower one is not capable of handling it and needs the assistance of the higher one. And guys, the reason that makes sense is because it applies to our own lives as well. If we're capable of doing something, we should do it. We shouldn't kind of need the assistance of someone else to do it. We should try and do it on our own first and foremost. And if we can't do it, then we should ask for the assistance of others. Okay, so that is the first section. This video is your video that's going to get you through the rest of the week. So please, if you haven't kind of been watching the videos, and I'm telling you this in the middle of the video, it seems kind of strange that I'm doing that. Please make sure you're watching these, because I give you a lot of information, not least of all the answers to the questions for your Unit 8 questions, and I will give you those right now. The first Chapter 9 question, your Unit 8 questions, asks you to just, I had the hiccup, sorry. Distinguish between and among these types of justice: commutative, distributive, legal, and social. So the four types of justice that I talked about. Commutative justice regulates the relationship of exchange between individuals. Distributive justice protects and guarantees the common welfare, i.e., what governments owe to the individual. The reverse of that is legal justice, which governs what individuals owe society as a whole and to their governments. Social justice applies the gospel message of Jesus to structures, systems, and laws in society in order to protect the dignity of persons and guarantee the rights of individuals. Your second question, what is meant by the universal destination of goods? That simply refers to the reality that all people are due what it takes to sustain their lives, right? Every person is owed food, water, shelter, etc., those things that are necessary for life. And we have a responsibility to make sure that every person has access to them. Your third question, why is social justice sometimes called contributive justice? And again, I answered this one. Each of us has been given many different talents, and therefore, according to those talents, those abilities that God has given us, we are all able to contribute to how society runs in our own way, right? From the littlest child, right, through their gift of happiness that they bring to the world around them, to the oldest person with the wisdom that they possess and are able to share. Whatever talents, whatever gifts we have that we can share, we have the right to contribute to society as best we can through those talents. The fourth question, you can find the answers to. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it asks you to list or name 10 things you owe others in justice and things others owe you. Do you have to earn these things? Explain. Think about the different societies you're part of, the different sports teams, the different clubs, etc., that you're part of. What do you owe them? What do they owe you? Think about your relationships. And you might not think about it in terms of equity, in terms of justice, because charity often rides through it. But what do you owe your friend? I'll give you one, right? If you expect your friend to give you the truth, don't you owe them the truth, right? And so that's one of many, okay? You need 10 for that one. Your next question, which is found on page number 245, in case you were wondering, you can actually find your unit questions in your textbook, asks us, discuss at least 2 important themes of Catholic social justice teaching. I gave you all 4. Just give me 2 of them, repeat them. The next question, define the virtue of solidarity. You'll notice that my definition is slightly different than the one the textbook gives you. You're responsible for knowing the one that I'm telling you, right? I'm going to give you the one that the textbook gives you, but it's really that definition that I gave you before. It's the recognition that every person we encounter is our brother and sister, right? And through that, we get to the definition your textbook gives you, the virtue of social charity or friendship, right? Now, what does that mean? Solidarity is a virtue of social charity or friendship that requires us to share our material wealth with others as well as our spiritual goods. Why? Well, because every person we encounter is our brother or sister, okay? So keep that in mind. Next question asks us about development. What does development have to do with justice and peace? Okay, and this goes to that kind of, that idea of helping the less fortunate, right? Nations that are less fortunate in particular, right? True development requires the sharing of the good news of Jesus Christ and his message of repentance, peace, and justice, right? That's part of the education. That's part of the sharing that we're called to do, right? And we are definitively a country that has stuff to share. And it seems weird that I'm saying this as we are kind of in the midst of, COVID-19 and the economic recession that accompanies it. But even so, we're way ahead of some of the other countries that have been affected by this. And so we still do have that responsibility to do the best we can to share with others. Next question asks us about loving the poor. Why should Christians have a special love for the poor? Christ himself taught us that, right? It is an imitation of Jesus, who preached the Beatitudes and lived in poverty himself and spoke so beautifully about the necessity of loving those most in need. Okay. Next question. What is the relationship between doing justice and putting into practice the virtue of charity? Um, well, it starts with that level of authority that we talked about, the government, right? Ideally, in terms of distributive justice, has the responsibility to provide the material needs of each member of society with the basic goods necessary to sustain life, right? But we live in a world where we know that that reality doesn't exist. And so that's where charity steps in. As Christians, we are called to offer individual charity to bring it into a reality, to make sure that the least of our midst that are lost by the government, that are overlooked by the government, that are neglected by the government, are taken care of. Okay? And finally, what have you personally done for the poor? What would you like to do in the future? Give your talents what you can realistically do. You guys have a lot more talent than you give yourselves credit for. You have a lot more gifts than you give yourselves credit for. So for this one, I really want you to do your best to answer it. How are you being called to serve those most in need? Okay? Have a good weekend. If you have any questions about any of this material, I will be available via email. If you have any questions about your quiz, I will be available via email. Don't hesitate to reach out. Some of you certainly should, given what you did on your quiz today. Don't hesitate. I'm telling you right now, and those of you that watch this video maybe want to share with people that don't know. While we have not had access to quiz and test corrections, starting the Tuesday after Memorial Day, if you reach out to me and ask me to reopen a test or quiz for you, I will, and you will be able to make quiz or test corrections to improve those scores. Now, this is really only going to be known by the people that are actually watching the videos. So if you're not watching, I don't know what to tell you. You should be watching. You should be hitting like. You should be hitting subscribe so that you know when these come out. That's all I got for you today. I will be posting one over the weekend to get you ready for Monday. Next week is, I'm sorry, I'm telling you in advance, it's going to be a busy week. I'm going to see you in class, brief classes, in Zoom classes on Monday and Wednesday. You are going to have a quiz on Thursday. You are going to have a test on Friday. You're going to have a whole bunch of stuff due next week, so I'm just warning you in advance. The good news is the following week and a half of school that we have left will be pretty laid back. You'll have a project, but it'll be a fairly easy one. But we got to get there first. Those of you that have given up, don't, right? I know we're all kind of shot at this point. This is not what we all signed up for, but it's the reality that we're facing. We can do it together. I love you guys. I miss you guys. And I'll see you on Monday. Have a good weekend.